pleasure to be here. Today, it's my honor to introduce Anjana Rajan and Kate Atwood. Anjana is the entrepreneur in residence at Cornell Tech, and Kate is CEO of LoCo Plus. Welcome, ladies. It's a pleasure to have you here. I know they came in from out of town. There's some people from out of town, but some of us locals here, we appreciate the travels under some weather conditions. But welcome, Anjana. Let's start with you. I'd love to know a little bit about your journey into the space before we dive into the Betterverse and Web3 for good. So why don't you give us a little background? What was your journey into the space, into Web3, and what you're doing today?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I usually introduce myself as a cryptographer. I was an engineer and wish I had paid more attention to my crypto classes in college many, many years ago. But really made my career start in Silicon Valley and was working at Palantir, where I was living in London and then was working in the Middle East. So it was really kind of came up in the security space, in the national security space, focusing on counterterrorism, and after the El Paso shooting in 2018, really turned my focus to domestic terrorism and how the framework of terrorism really needed to evolve for an inside threat. And in 2020, just literally right as the pandemic started, I was asked to become the first CTO of Polaris, which is one of the largest anti-human trafficking NGOs in the country that operates a national human trafficking hotline. And when I started, I asked my boss, the CEO, I was like, what are the security threats that you're dealing with? And she described them, classic cybersecurity threats. Is a separate thing from physical security threats. Physical security threats different than other threats. And then she made a comment that was almost a throwaway comment, and she said, a couple years ago, in 2018, this strange thing happened. One day in August, we got 7,000 calls to the hotline, which is a lot, more than what we normally do. And people were screaming at us, sending us death threats, because they thought we were a front for Hillary Clinton's pedophile ring. And then what happened was the senior staff and the board were doxxed, and there was a DDoS attack on the hotline. And as she's telling me this, I literally have goosebumps because this was not some random freak accident. It was a targeted attack by QAnon. And if you remember the timing, in the summer of 2020, QAnon was not yet part of the mainstream discourse. And I remember just quickly pulling up, from the archives, the Q drop that literally targeted our organization. And I showed it to her and I said, this is not a joke. This is actually very, very scary to me. And for me, I was actually terrified that I was now in charge of defending our organization against a domestic terrorist threat. And before I could even wrap my head around it, a few months, that summer, QAnon led another attack, this time on Wayfair, which was a furniture company, accusing them of being human traffickers. And even though we weren't the target of that attack, we got affected because all those people who were following that conspiracy theory were now making that shift from disinformation to misinformation, and were calling us, flooding our hotline with calls about a fake conspiracy, which meant real victims couldn't get help. And as I was watching this, it reminded me of a playbook I had seen before. It reminded me of the playbook that the Russian IRA used to subvert the 2016 election, or what the Saudi Arabians did to discredit their enemies, or what ISIS used to recruit women into their fold. And as we were heading into the 2020 presidential election, watching COVID unfold, watching the murder of George Floyd, I was very aware that we were just barreling towards this very terrifying inflection point that was going to get dangerous. And so I ended up writing this memo that was just more meant for internal uses that basically said that I was worried that QAnon was weaponizing conspiracies about human trafficking as a way to radicalize ordinary Americans to distrust their government, and that I was worried that it would lead to political violence. And ended up setting a partnership with some other folks and institutions, and we ended up building an AI model that could look at the social media narratives and conspiracy theories and predict when they would go viral and violent so that we as an organization could defend ourselves. And that ended up being very successful. We ended up becoming went from a defensive stance to an offensive stance. And we decided, maybe we should tell people about this. The administration had just won the election, and we were going to go brief them. But we said, let's give them some time to settle in. Let's give them 90 days, and then we'll bother them. I'm sure there's other priorities. And then, of course, first week back from the new year is January 6th. And January 6th was not only an affront to our democracy and an attack on our country, but it was personal for me, because the very people who were storming the Capitol steps were the very people who were threatening to kill us for the last 4 years. So fast forward a year later, and now it's fall of 2021, and Frances Haugen is testifying in front of Congress, and she's revealing that they already knew about this. They understood that authoritarianism and genocide and propaganda were growing on this platform. They knew that human trafficking was happening on their platform, and they did nothing. And I think everyone assumed that there was going to be some reckoning and a comeuppance for these tech leaders, and there wasn't. 3 weeks later, Mark Zuckerberg announced that he was pivoting to become Meta. Jack Dorsey left Twitter to go build his crypto company. And that's when I had this realization that everyone is staring at the fire and watching the ashes burn, and no one's paying attention to the arsonists and where they're going next. And that made me realize that my cryptography background was probably relevant now, and that who is thinking about protecting the next generation of the internet from what we just saw on Web 2. And I also saw that the political fault lines of crypto were deepening every single day, and that the way we win is not going to get angry and protest, but by Trojan horsing our way into the room and building it better. And so what I ended up writing, I joke, I call it my Jerry Maguire memo because it was not meant for anybody. I wrote it over Thanksgiving, and it was a math paper. It was a math paper that showed how human trafficking, terrorism, money laundering, all these national security threats could in fact happen on Web3. And here's the math on how we should architect Web3 to prevent that. And that paper caught the attention of our board of directors, which then turned it into an official stance of Polaris. And we published that paper in June. And now I've decided that someone has to go build that vision, and so I left Polaris in June. I'm now an entrepreneur in residence at Cornell Tech, working on bringing some of these ideas to fruition.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, right? It's so incredible, your background, what you've been through, your journey to Web3, quite different than some, right? So before we dive into that, Kate, we have to know your journey too. How are you going to tie that in? I believe in you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Atwood, and I am the co-founder and CEO of LoCo Plus. LoCo Plus is the first Web3 streaming platform for emerging filmmakers, content creators, and music artists. By activating local creator economies, which is how I'm going to tie it back in, we provide premium distribution to this next generation of our storytellers and our artists to allow them to publish, own, and earn, while also bringing back the value of having a platform that allows us to consume media at a local level. That's all done through our technology and our platform. And I'm super excited to be talking here today about Web3 and my personal journey to LoCo Plus. I think, on the heels of the work that we are doing just infrastructurally around safety, I think we can all agree that Web3, when looked at, the biggest response to Web 2 is let's be intentional about how this is built. Web 2 is built under a premise of build it very fast and very universal. And while that did open up a lot of doors and a lot of connection and a lot of knowledge, it also presented a lot of adversity and a lot of problems. My background is really, I like to call myself an architect of community. I've worked across all business segments and built companies and brands. Most recently, I led a team out of Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce called Choose ATL. And Choose ATL was a response to the paradigm shift that was happening in economic development with the millennials entering the workforce. It went from economic development traditionally was bring the enterprise, build the enterprise, and they will come. Well, with millennials and the digital divide, they changed that because they could have jobs anywhere. It wasn't just based on industry. And so Atlanta, which was starting to have this big boom post-recession, was bringing all these big companies, but it had a problem with talent. It's college and university students were leaving, and it wasn't attracting the new. And so Choose ATL was really birthed to help solve that problem. And my team and I had an incredible run. Hopefully you've felt some of the vibe of Atlanta. I know Miami's having its moment right now, but we really had a huge turnaround in our talent. The tech talent started coming. The film obviously became a big industry. And as my team shifted from paying attention to attraction, right? So a lot of times it's about how do we get more people here? How do we get the top talent here? How do we get the top startups here? We also started to focus on retention. And in looking at retention and doing focus groups with college and university students or talent that had already chosen Atlanta as home, we realized that this was a group of individuals who was struggling to connect to the community that they were choosing to call home. 7 out of 10 millennials feel estranged from their local community. Now, my aha moment was, okay, they have never had localized media. There's never been a medium that has worked for them when it comes to localizing content. Papers are dead, TV is dying, radio is hanging on by a thread. So how do we reintroduce content in a way that can be localized and efficient so that young people can be better connected to the community, whether they call it home or whether it's a place that they're visiting? The parallel paradigm shift that was happening was the media entertainment paradigm shift. We were seeing the fall. We were starting to see the fall. We now know the headlines are coming of the corporate media economy and the rise of the creator economy. Content creation is now one of the fastest growing small business segments across the globe. So to connect with millennials and to build a medium that they could consume that could be localized meant not building corporately produced and published media. It meant giving rise to the emerging content creators so that they could actually, like any entrepreneur, have a home market advantage to launch and grow. So that was what birthed LoCo Plus. I have an incredible co-founder, Megan Matashek. She is in Denver. And we connected because she actually came out of the film industry. She worked for George Lucas, which, if you know Lucasfilm, Star Wars, you know he is the king of IP. And she came out of that industry knowing that the paradigm shift was happening and that she, as a young talent on the rise, was seeing her opportunity to make it in Hollywood shrink, right? So the onset of Netflix and streaming, it was like it was going to give a greater opportunity to independent content creators. And now, because of what we're seeing and the conglomerates, and we're all a part of it even as consumers, she saw that door was closing. And so we came together to build LoCo Plus for the future of the industry. We launched in Atlanta. We had an incredible pilot there. We're launching in Denver next week. Then we're going to Milwaukee. I'm hoping to get Miami on that list. But we are the horizon of Web3, building it intentionally so that the promise of Web3, which is security, which is equity, which is ownership, can reach its full potential. And that's got to come from the bottom up, and it's got to come from us being intentional about how the infrastructure and the systems are built. I know we talk a lot about system change in the world of economic development and in the public sector. This is the opportunity to build a new system across the board. So we can't lose sight of that. It's such a unique time that we have these paradigm shiftings happening all at once. And I love this conference and what Smart City stands for because it's bringing all three of those paradigm shifts. The economic development paradigm shift, which is the human, the society paradigm shift, the media entertainment paradigm shift, and the tech paradigm shift is all happening now, and we want to line that up so that we can build a new system so that we can solve a lot of these problems that we have just been turning in our head for decades now. And I'll close on this because I know we're going to get into it, but activating local creator economies is one of the most efficient, most accessible ways to start to close the wealth gap. 95% of the earnings that happen in the creator economy right now on YouTube, on TikTok, they're going to 5% of the content creators. 5%. Imagine if we had a construct in which we could just move those earnings to 10%, to 15%. And that talent is everywhere. It's not just in Hollywood and New York anymore, especially post-COVID. The creative talent is everywhere. I guarantee you it's in your backyard. And it is a wonderful way to immediately activate the artists and the creators who are going to power Web3 from day one, starting today. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kate. I mean, we can go talking for hours here, but I know we have a time check. But I want to take a step back for a second. I see a lot of new folks that have entered the room. And so we're here talking about the Betterverse, right? Web3 and Metaverse for good. So I want to take a step back. And so obviously a lot of folks are wondering, here in Miami, for the most part, we're on board. You know, there's a lot of people on board. We've heard about Web3. How many of you in this room have heard at least about Web3? Raise your hand. See, we got a lot of folks. We understand it. We get the point. But in order for mass adoption to truly occur, right, what needs to happen? Like, what can they give us examples, case studies, something you've experienced that we can all understand from a city perspective?
Just like step back, you know, again, I think we get it, and I get a question a lot, especially from folks in DC who work in the government, are like, do I have to care about this? Like, why? And I kind of help them understand, like, you know, if you were to ask anyone in the national security industry, what is the single biggest threat to our democracy? Without even skipping a beat, they'd say it's anti-government extremism, it's militia-driven government anti-extremism, it's racially motivated violent extremism. And then I say, why is that a threat to the United States? And they say, because it's showing the crumbling and distrust of our institutions. And I say, okay, now like listen to what some of the more zealot folks in the Web3 community are saying. They're saying decentralization. What do you think that means? And I say, like, in its worst form, in its most insidious form, it could also be weaponized by bad actors who also want to see the crumbling of institutions, who do not believe in the value of the US dollar, who do not see the value in a sovereign nation. And that is the threat that you have to mitigate against when you're designing for this new frontier. So, you know, for me, we're in a room of some of the most prolific mayors of the country and their CIOs. And one thing I spend a lot of time thinking about for this community is what's coming up in 2026? It's the World Cup. It'll be in the United States, it'll be in Canada, it'll be in Mexico. I think for many of you who work in mayor's offices, and I've actually read all of your work, many of you have written these brilliant, those of you who are chosen to be the 16 host cities have written these really brilliant proposals on human rights, right? We're seeing what's happening in Qatar, lots of human trafficking, and so the mandate for this next World Cup is that we need to be better about safety and human rights. And so I was reading all of your guys' work and was really impressed with the thoughtfulness in which these mayor's offices are really putting together their strategy for the next 4 years. And many of us are very aware of how sports plays a very key part of both our national security infrastructure. We've seen the terrorist attacks in the Munich Olympics. We saw the Boston bombing. I was actually in Paris in 2015 when the ICE attacks happened. And we now understand like why these three things make sense: sports and national security, counterterrorism, and human trafficking. We understand that nexus, which is really exciting. And when I was at Polaris, a big part of what my team was thinking about was, what is our World Cup strategy? What I urge you all to think about is the sports industry is actually one of the first industries to go all in on crypto, right? We're seeing this market grow like 100% year over year. We're seeing every major sports company have a major crypto strategy. And we're seeing these two things completely unrelated, right? So what I urge folks to think about, and really interrogate a bit is, okay, if I've now told you that, if I told you 4 years ago that Facebook and Instagram would be the #1 method of recruitment for human trafficking, what's going to be the arena for human trafficking in 4 more years, right? Can you imagine that if I'm a child sex trafficker profiting off of child sexual abuse material, why an NFT might be a very lucrative medium for me? And usually when I say this, I get blank stares, and they say, no, I don't understand that. Can you imagine how a terrorist organization could use the metaverse to simulate a terrorist attack and become more effective? Can you imagine how instead of Brittany Griner being held unfairly in Russia, her avatar is being held for ransom for geopolitical gain? Can you start thinking about this threat model for the future so that when we get there in 4 years, your teams are prepared for that moment, not the moment of the past? And I think this is where we as kind of civic servants and technologists have to kind of think together, because if we're starting to build now for the future, you have to kind of imagine where the chess move's going so that you're not missing it. And I think that's the mistake we've made in the past when we've thought about protecting our national security interests and our human rights. And so that has been, I think, an example, I think, for this audience that might resonate, which is December 18th is when the Qatar World Cup ends, and it's now the time for the United States to shine, and let's start understanding how the landscape is going to change in 4 years.
Thank you, Anjana. That was great. Kate?
Yeah, and I think on the side of that, to tie it to those comments is, I mean, I think we can all agree coming out of Web 2 that there are few people that hold most of the power and most of the resources. And those people also power our media systems. And that's why we really believe in, both the threat and the opportunity is we have to build a new media system. And we have to do that from the ground up. And that's obviously what the vision of LoCo Plus is, because if we're going to deliver, again, on those tenets of Web3, which are the ownership, the equity, the transparency, all of those things that we know across the board will help make our communities healthier, make our wealth disparities shrink, make our civility and our socio-political system even healthier and more cohesive. That's got to start with a strong media system. And if Meta if the people that have powered Web 2 and powered the media system for the past 2 decades are the ones that solve this from the top down, that's not good. It's really not good. And I think, we're both taking on behemoths of industries. I think that's what's so interesting about, we're sitting here talking about the Betterverse. I think in our conversations, we realized, we're not taking on some small ships here, but we have so much conviction that the volume of people and constituents are looking for that too. But we need our cities. We need the places that have the concentration of those people to be knowledgeable and to be aware and to be brought along as Web3 figures itself out. A lot of the noise that we're hearing on a consumer level, or I can even talk about the creators that we have on LoCo Plus, 8 out of 10 of them have heard of Web3. None of them know how to activate it. 7 out of 10 of them don't even know how to own their own IP. So we're starting at an elementary level, a foundational level, and educating and leveling up those creators. But they're so thirsty to know. They see that this is their opportunity for the first time in the history of the creative class to own their own stuff. And that's a super, super powerful time for them. And I think if we at a local level can aggregate and organize these creators so that they can be educated and can really be the power, that's inevitably how we build up this system from the ground up. And I think that if you leave here with anything from me, it's that you really do have the power to create a new media system in your backyard that will start to check the boxes on every single one of your agendas. Voting, community health and engagement, getting these young people from being online to offline, and local tourism, because you're going to start to have your storytellers be the very people that have chosen the place that you're building to call home. So again, both the threat is that we let the top-down powerhouses solve this problem. The opportunity is that we can build this from the ground up.
And you both made great points. And again, I think we need to look at, so in a recent quote from Matthew Ball from a recent video, What's the Metaverse? He said, in order for us to truly be prepared for what's ahead, we must educate. And I think a lot of us that are really interested in the space and Web3 in general spend a lot of time providing education, and that's not defining the definition of the metaverse or Web3, but that's having real conversations around how we can leverage the technology. So I wonder from your perspective and doing LoCo Plus and Anjana with you as well with what you're trying to develop to actually solve a problem. I face constantly, I work with a lot of women around the world, and so different countries with not the same available resources, and they still don't understand what to do and they don't think they can make an impact. So we're left with Meta, we're left with the majors to come out and do with the technology what they want to, is what I've heard. And so I believe there is an opportunity to make a difference. There's 7 billion people in the world, half of that which are women, and there's enough power here to create a difference. What are some ways in which you can encourage people to not be afraid? And I would say when we started with the internet, we didn't know that we would be obsessed with our phones today, right? We didn't know. We were still talking about what's the @ I don't know how many of you have seen that video from Good Morning America, but they didn't even understand how it all worked, what websites we're going to do. And today we record everything on our phones. We have conversations on our phones. We're on apps daily. So the technology is only going to continue to evolve. So you're either here for it or you kind of stay behind and complain. So I'm kind of curious from your perspectives. Maybe Anjana, you could start and give us some ideas in which you can encourage people to find the right education, get involved in projects, attach them to real solutions, and create actionable steps.
Yeah, I'm a cryptographer, so I care deeply about the success of Web3, right? And I worry that we're not fully understanding what the power of this math is. It's it's the single most beautiful thing. I could nerd about this for hours, but it's there's something so beautiful and elegant about cryptography and the mathematics behind it that I think we're just still not even aware of. And I encourage those of you who are builders to really go deep into what is the problem we're solving and why does this math need to exist. One of the things that I think a lot about is this dichotomy that has existed my entire adult life, which is on one side you have people who are advocating for national security and public safety, and on the other side you have people who are advocating for privacy and civil liberties. And I've heard someone said this really well, and they said these are not opposing virtues. You've got on one side you've got Dick Cheney, and the other side you've got Edward Snowden, and they've convinced us that the other person is wrong. And it's well, actually, I would like both privacy and civil liberties and not get killed in a terrorist attack, right? I don't need to compromise on that. And for for the last 20 years, right, this entire century, since we just honored the anniversary of 9/11 last week or this week, and I think about that a lot, right? As a defining moment in my life. Why are we having these debates? What can this cryptography actually finally solve? How do we actually have both? What does this unlock for us? And I think right now, the problems that I'm seeing being solved in Web3 are still experimental and not, frankly, solving the most important problems. And so to answer your question of how do the local communities actually play a role, well, they're the ones who actually are on the front lines. They are forward deployed on the single most important issues in their community, not the person sitting in their ivory tower in Silicon Valley. And I think this is why when we talk about building new engineering teams, we need a new paradigm for this moment. And this was something I thought a lot about in my last role as I was building and scaling my engineering organization, which is we need a new way of thinking about this. It's no longer just move fast and break things, but it's also not just digital service in the traditional civic tech way, right? And so we came up with a new framework that we called mission engineering. And the way we explained mission engineering was that to be on my team, you needed to have 4 qualities. Number 1, you need to be in deep tech, right? And that can mean a lot of different things. It could mean cryptography, it could mean AI, it could mean security, it could mean whatever form of that, but you had to understand really rigorous technology. Number 2, you had to be interdisciplinary. right? You have to have the humility to recognize that you're not the smartest person in the room, that you need to work with that policy expert or that person who understands this geopolitical issue or this really specific subject matter, and you have to work together. Number 3, you have to be trauma-informed. We were working with survivors and victims of human trafficking, and you have to understand that the way you think about user design is even more complicated in this context. And then finally, you need to be able to respond to a rapidly changing threat landscape. And the way I kind of describe this in shorthand, I would say if you took the speed and innovation of the private sector, the complexity and nuance of the policy sector, the compassion of the humanitarian sector, and the fearlessness of the security sector, then you've got yourself a mission engineer. And when I built this framework, it was meant to be like a thing that anybody in any institution could create on their own. It was not meant to be a proprietary thing just for us, because it was realizing that this ethos scales to a number of problems. And I think if you can think about building your teams and your engineering organizations and your companies with this mindset, then you're going to realize that actually maybe that like Cornell engineer, I'm going to make fun of Cornell, that Cornell engineer isn't actually not the right fit, but it's that person who doesn't have a college degree, who is hustling and resilient and compassionate and really brilliant, who you should actually recruit and hire. And that's how you actually really build true diversity and inclusion, because you're actually saying, I'm not doing this to fill a quota, I'm doing because I'm truly getting the best. And the best are the people with lived experience, with a creative eye, with grit and hustle and resilience, and that looks different than the paradigm that we've seen in the elite halls that many of us walk in. And so I think that's how we engage the local community. That's how we reframe this problem, that it is not just about building yet another crypto project because you can. It's about starting with the problem and saying, what are the tools to get us to the right answer?
That's wonderful, and we had a great call connecting with each other from different parts of the world, and we talked about the importance of coexistence in industries and skill sets and how valuable that was to bring them together for this to truly be like an emergence in technology, for it to bring value, which is perfect, Kate, when we talk about LoCo Plus.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think the opportunity to make this accessible now, while some of the tools and the infrastructure continue to sort itself out. It's why we like to say, focus on the system, because the accessibility is starting to build trust again. And you can move change along if you meet people where they're at and you make their lives better, or you help them make money, right? I mean, that is, not to make it sound too transactional, but at a local level, we can start to do that now and then have the community and the trust built so that when these tools and the infrastructure become more adoptable at a massive scale, they're going to trust the infrastructure that delivers it to them. And I fundamentally believe that we can ensure that more people are brought along in Web3 than in Web2 by that transparency happening on day one. And that's why at LoCo Plus we talk about we're building Web3 in Web2, because we're focusing right now on what that culture will look like, what that community will look like. And creators are, I'll just have a little side note about, just being an entrepreneur and, you're out there and you're trying to raise money and, as you can imagine, everybody's like, well, how are you going to get anybody from YouTube? Or how are you going to get, we realize we're disrupting some major incumbents. But we've seen so many creators move to our platform so fast, and it's because of our promise of ownership, community, and quality. Well, those 3 tenets are the parallel tenets of Web3. And so we're already seeing the constituents want this and want this to be better. And I think we can bring all of that energy into a system that starts to build on itself with the tenets of security and trust and transparency today. So I think that's the biggest thing, is like we don't have to sit back and wait for the crypto to figure itself out, the NFTs. I mean, there is still some time and some work to be done to make sure those are the most secure and the most stable. But we can start to build the system and the infrastructure now. And I think if we focus on that action now, today, when this thing flips, we're going to feel really, really good about the potential that it can reach versus trying to dig ourselves out of a lot of the problems and the disparities that have been caused by Web 2.
That's incredible. And of course, the bear market, we had to talk about it. We are talking about the Betterverse, but at the same time, the bear market has scared a lot of people. I would say from my perspective is weeded off what doesn't need to stay. So what kind of encouragement? I feel like people need the encouragement because that's what they recognize. That's what's in the forefront. That's what the media is presenting. The failures are phase one of really Web3. And so what kind of positive insights, and Kate, maybe you want to start it and we'll end it with Anjana.
Well, when I talk especially about this from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, it's don't get caught up in the noise of this failing or this NFT project being a fraud, right? A lot of that noise is to distract us by, again, these powers that are trying to figure out the system. You know what I'm saying? So I think educate yourself just on those tenets of the possibility of ownership, the foundation of a tiered market system existing again in our society, the ability to have small business, middle markets, and large markets existing again. This is the promise that this is the North Star that we should be keeping our eyes on. And so as we communicate about it, remind everybody that we're just at the beginning of this. Educate yourself on the foundational level, and that NFTs and DAOs and a lot of the blockchain, these are applications and tools, but there's a much bigger system change that's happening, and that's what is really, really exciting. And that should be accessible. That should be understandable, especially from a content creator standpoint, to everybody, because they're already looking for it. They just don't have a place to go for it yet.
Right, and it doesn't have to be easily understood by everyone in the beginning, otherwise we'd all be doing it and we'd all be Facebook giants, but we are not, right? So, Anjana, your points, please.
When we were backstage, we were laughing that the real winner of COVID was a person who came up with a QR code because they waited a very long time to have their moment in the sun. And so if you are having a moment of despair with the crypto markets, just think of that person and hold on. Again, I think life is long, right? Careers are long, companies, if you're successful, are long. But you build resilient, iconic companies, not because you've chased a fad, but because you've truly built something people want, right? And if you're in a moment where the markets are down and you're not able to really build or think about this, go forward deploy where the problems are. Go deep into your community and deeply understand the earned insight that you uniquely can have by being part of that local community. And again, I think what you're doing, Kate, is so important, because the reasons we are able to build and innovate is because we're seeing something that nobody else does. So go focus your time on that, and then as you understand what the technology's capabilities are, it'll become really intuitive of what you're going to build next. And I think that it would be my advice to anyone who's looking to build.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much. I think what we've learned here today, Web3 and the Metaverse present a lot of opportunities. It's still in its infancy stages, and we are still iterating and we are still building, but it can do good, and it's up to you to do that. Thank you so much.
And if you're interested in LoCo Plus, go locoplus.com is our website. We are growing, and I'd love to talk to anybody. I like to call LoCo Plus the bat signal to activate your local creator economy. And so we like to find anchors in each of these markets to help us launch. We have the technology, so it's just about really organizing the creators and the ecosystem that can get this work going in your city, in your community today. And is that Tara Lynn? Shout out, stand up. This is my girl, Choose ATL. She was part of my team. I was like, is that her? Anyways, so thank you guys so much, and I look forward to talking to you. And thank you for moderating. This is brilliant, and for hosting us in Miami.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.